changing your life one story at a time. This is the Chicken Soup for the Soul podcast with Editor-in-Chief Amy Newmark.
Hey, it's Amy Newmark with your daily dose of Chicken Soup for the Soul inspiration to make you simply happy. There's a lot of talk about refugees and immigration these days. And despite all the talk about bans in the U.S., there are plenty of people making it in each week, escaping the terrors of the countries that they're coming from. There's been a lot of attention paid to Canada, where immigrants have always been welcomed, as they have through most of U.S. history. Canada in particular has been making a big effort to welcome refugees from Syria. And our new book, Chicken Soup for the Soul, The Spirit of Canada, contains several stories about those refugees and their new lives in Canada. The first story I want to share with you is by a Syrian named Rahaf. She had a cousin who already lived in Canada, and when her cousin came to visit Syria in 2001, Rahaf taught her Arabic and her cousin taught her English. The years passed, and Rahaf earned her university degree in applied chemistry. Life was good. But then the war started, and Rahaf wanted to get out. She saw her friends and coworkers being killed, and she dreamt of somehow making it to Canada. In 2015, she decided to sign up with one of those human smugglers to get on one of those rubber dinghies to Greece. She knew there was a good chance she wouldn't make it. We've all seen those horrible reports about the thousands of lives lost in the Mediterranean as those rubber dinghies and little boats sink and drown those poor refugees. Rahaf's cousin in Canada convinced her not to go on one of those boats. She said that Rahaf should wait and that there were private Canadian citizens, churches, and other organizations that were sponsoring refugees to go to Canada. Rahaf worked for the Syrian government, so it was illegal for her to leave the country. So even though she didn't go the route of the little boat in the Mediterranean, she still had a long and truly terrifying journey by bus and by foot, making it through 16 checkpoints, each manned by a different armed group. She says some of the men were kind and helpful, but most were aggressive and filled with hate. She traveled north, and she got out of Syria by crossing the border into Turkey. From there, she made it to Istanbul, where she could stay with another cousin who had made it out of Syria a few weeks before her. After that, it took 6 months for her to get the paperwork that would allow her to emigrate to Canada. But she got that done, and Rahaf now lives in British Columbia. She's a new resident in Canada, just starting to make her way, but we also had stories in the book from Syrians who arrived in Canada decades ago, because people have been leaving Syria for a long time. My own husband's grandfather left Syria about 100 years ago because there was no opportunity there for him, especially as a Melkite Catholic. And my husband's paternal grandparents came over from Lebanon, where they were Maronite Catholics. One of our writers in Chicken Soup for the Soul, The Spirit of Canada, talks about how she emigrated from Lebanon via Syria back in the 1970s to escape the war in Lebanon, and how grateful she was to become a Canadian citizen. A.A. Adorian tells us that recently she met another Catholic refugee from Syria, this time one who escaped from Syria and made his way to Lebanon and then on to Canada. He said that he was happy in Syria, but then one day when he was at work, he was beaten for being Catholic, and then his Muslim coworker was beaten almost to death for being the wrong kind of Muslim. So he felt he couldn't go to work anymore. He was a freshman in college, so he was going to college, but one day when he was taking an exam, he heard what sounded like a jet flying too close to the building, and the next thing he knew, the glass walls of his classroom were shattered, and a lot of his fellow students were injured. So work wasn't safe, school wasn't safe, and his home in Syria wasn't safe either. So he and his family escaped to Lebanon and then made arrangements to go to Canada. Now they live in Toronto, and he goes back to the immigrant center to help other refugees as they arrive, because they need some place to go. And just as he and his family were helped, so he is paying it forward for the next group of immigrants. We have numerous additional stories in Chicken Soup for the Soul, The Spirit of Canada, about immigration and refugees and that Canadian attitude toward the cultural mosaic that makes up the country. As Canada prepares to celebrate its 150th anniversary on July 1st, we're happy to have created this book that celebrates what makes this relatively young country so special. I'm Amy Newmark, and I want to thank you for listening to the Chicken Soup for the Soul podcast today. If you want to learn more about the book today's stories came from, Chicken Soup for the Soul, The Spirit of Canada, go to our website, chickensoup.com, and click on the picture of the Spirit of Canada book. You'll see a barn with a big Canadian flag on its side. Come back tomorrow for another episode of the Chicken Soup for the Soul podcast. You've probably been the person in charge when a small child has lost his or her very favorite stuffed animal, and you know how bad that feels. Now imagine losing it at LaGuardia Airport. We'll discuss that story tomorrow.